If there's one thing that's consistent about humanity throughout the centuries, it's that we crave competition. We absolutely love it. For us, there is simply no better feeling than besting another human in tests of strength and skill. And so, we structured our society around it. School is competition, work is competition, but that just wasn't enough for us. We needed competition to fill every waking hour of our lives. It began with simple tests of strength. Ancient cave paintings depict early humans partaking in foot races and wrestling matches. As the years went on and our tools became more and more complex, so did our outlets for competition. The tests of strength would never fade, but alongside them came tests of skill. Who was the best with a javelin? Who was the best with a bow and arrow? We held tournaments to find these answers, but even this was not enough. Deriving competition from the everyday tools of life was too limiting, and so we invented games. Games which were played not to survive the wilderness or conquer some enemy nation, but simply for the players to find out who was the best among them. As society became more advanced, so too did the games we played. Eventually, we invented video games. Games which were no longer bound by the limitations of our physical reality. If you could dream it, you could play it. And if you could play it, you could compete in it. As such, there is a wide variety of games for a hopeful gamer to choose to compete in. Some people choose fighting games. Some people choose rhythm games. Some people choose MOBAs or RTS games or first-person shooters. Some people take games not designed for competition and squeeze it out of them anyways. With the advent of speedrunning, any game can be turned into competition. Glory is up for grabs in every, and I mean every, video game. Some choose to speedrun the games of their childhood. Some choose to speedrun the new frontiers of modern gaming. But some people choose a game that, for most others, is nothing more than a cute daily ritual. A game that offers familiarity and comfort in our hectic lives. A game that 99.9% of the player base could not fathom spending more than a couple minutes a day on. A game that the average person would never remotely consider dedicating hours, days, weeks to perfecting. A game that, in every way, seemed truly impossible to speedrun. And yet, when I said there was glory in every game, I meant every game. You see, some people choose to fulfill their fundamental desire to compete by speedrunning Wordle. And this is their story. My name is Pokecheese, and welcome to the history of Wordle speedrunning. Wordle started as a small side project for software engineer Josh Wardle. The game is easy to learn. There's a hidden answer word and you need to find it. You start by guessing a word. After your guess, each letter will turn one of three colors. A gray means the letter is not in the word. A yellow means the letter is in the word, but not in the right place. A green means the letter is in the word and in the right place. You have 6 guesses to figure out the answer word or you lose. Simple enough. A couple months after its initial launch in October of 2021, Wardle decided to add an easy way for players to share the results of their game with their friends. He made it so, after a completed game, players could click a button to copy an emoji grid to their clipboard, which could then be pasted into any communication app they desire. The emoji grid allowed players to convey the results of their game to their friends without spoiling the word, encouraging those friends to give the game a go for themselves. This small change worked wonders, and by early 2022, Wordle was a household name among the citizens of the internet. In a way, we can attribute the success of Wordle itself to our love for competition. Many of us have delighted in lightly mocking the friend who got it in 6, or calling the friend who got it in 2 a lucky bastard. However, this is not a competition that we invest ourselves in seriously. No one remembers what your Wordle score was a week ago. Hell, they probably don't even remember what it was yesterday. There is no lasting glory in Wordle. It's less of a competitive exercise and more of a social activity, something to spark conversations among groups of friends or family. At least, that's what it was to most people. For some of us, Wordle was something a bit more significant. It began on January 11th, 2022, when the speedrunner Boxaba uploaded the first Wordle speedrun to YouTube, simply titled Wordle Speedrun, 10 rounds in 349.432. However, to the average observer, these were not typical rounds of Wordle. You see, even at this early stage, Bokhtaba realized something that would become fundamental to the future of the speedrun. Most players play Wordle by typing one word, getting information from that word, and then typing their next guess using the information from that prior word. By doing this, they slowly narrow down the field of possibilities until they stumble upon the answer. However, that means that on every guess, the player needs to stop and think of a new guess, a guess based upon the information given by the previous guesses. Unfortunately, the words stop and think are not in the vocabulary of the average speedrunner. As such, Bokhtaba played the game using a different method. Instead of typing one guess at the start, Bokhtaba immediately typed out 5 guesses in quick succession. Only after typing out all 5 guesses would he then stop to think about the answer. With this method, he had managed to reduce the multiple stop and think periods of a typical Wordle game down to just 1. And even this brief period of calculation was made even easier by the fact that he had 5 whole guesses of information to work with, meaning the answer would often jump out at him in a matter of seconds. This technique of quickly typing multiple predetermined guesses before actually playing the game was revolutionary, and will be used in every single world record going forward. The specific combination of words used would come to be known as a starting set. In this case, Bokthaba's starting set was Raged, Clift, Oxbow, Nymph, and Zooks. But why did he choose these 5 specific words? Well, together they cover 23 out of 26 letters of the alphabet, with the missing letters being the relatively uncommon J, V, and Q. This makes it so, in most cases, finding the Wordle answer is simply a matter of unscrambling a partial anagram. This allows the thinking step of the solving process to be as short as possible, which of course is the goal of the speedrun. There's another, perhaps more subtle standard that was established with this run. 10 rounds in 349.432. This is an important number. It is short enough that the run could be completed in minutes, yet long enough that the run doesn't solely rely on random chance. You see, the optimal strategy for a single Wordle speedrun is simple. Pick a word, guess it, and if it's wrong, reset the board and try again. Repeat until the Wordle is solved in one guess. This is not a particularly fun or engaging process, and by upping the number of rounds to 10, Bokhtaba made the speedrun significantly more interesting. This is the part of the story where I come in. I remember stumbling across Bokthaba's video after searching Wordle speedrunning out of pure curiosity. At the time, it only had a couple hundred views. I watched the video, and as a casual Wordler at the time, was extremely interested in the new style of Wordle Bokthaba was displaying. However, another thought entered my mind, a thought that traces its origins back to the basic competitive instincts of our species. I thought I could do better. And so, with the fires of competition burning in my soul, I got to work. The first thing to address was the website Bokthaba was playing on. As you have probably guessed, he was not playing on the official Wordle website, as that site only lets users do 1 word per day. Instead, he was playing on a near-exact clone of the website created by QB the Cube. This version not only let him play more than 1 Wordle per day, but it also randomized the answer each time. For what the site was trying to accomplish, QB's version of Wordle was functionally perfect. However, for the purposes of going fast, both it and the official version of the site had a glaring issue. Every time you type in a guess, Wordle has a short animation of the letters flipping over, revealing the color of each letter. This animation takes a little under 2 seconds per guess, which adds up over the course of a 6-guess game. QB's version, being a perfect copy, keeps this animation and it can be seen all throughout Bokthaba's run. To fix this, I did some searching across other Wordle clones and found one called Hello Wordle, made by Chordbug. Chordbug's version made the colors appear instantly upon hitting enter to submit your guess. As far as I could tell, it otherwise seemed to be the same as base Wordle, so I decided to adopt Hello Wordle as my speedrunning platform of choice. The next thing I wanted to look at was Bokthaba's starting set. I could see the vision behind his choices, but I didn't agree that they were the best way to go. For example, how often were the X in Oxbow or the Z in Zooks being utilized? It seemed pretty likely to me that they would go completely unused across 10 Wordles, and I figured those spots would be better used trying to get greens for more common letters. However, I wanted to be as sure as possible that this was the case, so I did some research. Wordle obviously has a predefined list of valid guesses that players are allowed to use. The idea is that your guesses need to be real words, so Wordle needs a list of real words to reference. This list at the time contained 12,972 words. However, many of these supposed real words are not words that any of us would ever recognize. If any of these obscure words were ever picked to be the answer word, it would be a very frustrating experience to say the least. Thus, there needed to be a second list, a list which only contains the 5-letter words that the majority of the player base would be familiar with. This list, at the time, contained 2,315 words. This list became known as the answer list. With both of these lists being public knowledge, I began to study them in order to find a better starting set. The first thing I did was generate a frequency map for how often each letter appears in an answer word. For example, the letter E was given a score of 1,233. Note that I counted a letter multiple times if it appears in a word multiple times, so this does not mean that the letter E is in 1,233 words. Rather, it means that across the entire list, there are 1,233 individual instances of the letter E. The idea behind this was to score how often a letter, if it's contained in a guess, turns yellow or green. A higher score means it turns yellow or green more often, and as such we can assume it's a better letter to include in our guesses. Next, I generated another frequency map, but instead of looking at the entire answer list, I only looked at the first letter of each word. I called this a positional frequency map. This map looked very different from the previous map. Even though E was the most common letter overall, when we only look at the first position, we can see that E is merely the 14th most frequent letter, with the letter S taking the top spot by a significant margin. The idea behind this map was to score how many greens would appear if we were to include that letter in the first position of a guess. As you might expect, I made 5 of these positional frequency maps, one for each of the 5 positions a letter can appear in. With these, I devised a simple system for scoring the effectiveness of a given guess. To demonstrate this, let's take a look at the word which ended up scoring the highest by this metric, soar. We start by looking at the general frequency map. For each letter in soar, we find its score in the map and simply add them up. Then, we look at the letter in each position and find that letter's score in that position's respective map. So, since the first letter in soar is S, we look at the first frequency map, find the score for the letter S, and add that score to the total. The second letter is O, so we look at the second frequency map, find the score for O, and add that to the total. We repeat that process for each letter in each position. At the end, we have a final score of 6,062 for soar. I wrote some code that did this process for every single guess in the guess list. Of course, my end goal was to generate a combination of 5 guesses that would score as high as possible. However, there were 2 obvious problems with expanding my method to more than one guess. First, my scoring system has no way to account for redundant information. Thus, if I were just to scale the system up to 5 guesses without changing anything, my system would give me a 5-word set of soar, 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 soar. Basically, I had created a bot who wanted me to employ the famous horse strategy in my speedruns. This wasn't exactly what I wanted. Second, the amount of possible combinations of words grows exponentially as you add more words. If I were to score every combination of 2 words, I would need to score 84,129,906 pairs. To score every combination of 3 words, I would need to score 363,721,626,940 triples. You get the idea. As I add words to the starting set, the amount of combinations I need to score increases very, very quickly. I'm already not the most efficient coder in the world, and my code was written in Python, which is a relatively slow language. Thus, trying to do a full scoring of even just combinations of 4 words would cause my code to run for an unreasonable amount of time. I wanted to beat Bokhtava's record before anyone else did, so I couldn't afford to wait. I needed some shortcuts. The first thing I did was add a constraint to the groups of words I was scoring. I decided that I wanted the first 4 words to not repeat any letters, thus giving me at least 20 letters worth of information. Therefore, I decided to start by finding a set of 4 words that fulfilled this condition. This solves the horse problem that I mentioned earlier. Since letters cannot repeat, information will never be redundant. However, even with this restriction, my code would still take too long to score all valid combinations of 4 words. I needed to reduce the runtime further. To accomplish this, I decided to make my algorithm more greedy. Instead of trying to score an entire set of 4 guesses at once, I started by just scoring every guess. Then, I cut that list down to just the top 100 highest scoring guesses. After doing that, I then ran the scoring algorithm only on pairs, which included one of those top 100 guesses. This would still mean I'm evaluating 1,297,200 pairs, but for a computer that number is very manageable. Remember, I was still doing a check to make sure no letters were repeated, so my output only contained pairs which met that condition. I then repeated this process, cutting down my result list of pairs to the top 100 and then running the algorithm again, only evaluating triples which included those 100 pairs. After one more iteration of this on the resulting triples, I ended up with a list of 100 high-scoring 4-guess groups with which to base my starting set on. However, I needed a fifth word, and since I knew I didn't want 25 unique letters, I had to change up this last step slightly. So, for the final word, I ran a modified version of the algorithm. This time, I would allow repeat letters. However, for repeat letters, only their positional frequency would contribute to the total score. Basically, if I was going to repeat letters, I wanted those letters to give me as many greens as possible, and my modified system was designed to emphasize that while de-emphasizing repeated yellows. The idea with this entire method was to cut down runtime significantly by, at each step, only further exploring sets that looked promising. This meant that my search was nowhere close to exhaustive. It is possible, even likely, that there exist better scoring word sets that I did not find. However, I just wanted a set that would be good enough to beat Boktaba's record, and I knew this method would give me just that. By the way, if there are any expert coders watching this video who have any ideas on how I could have improved this entire process, I encourage you to leave those ideas in the comments. I'm sure that this whole idea could have been done much cleaner, and I'm very curious as to what I missed. Anyways, at the end of all that, I was left with a list of 100 sets of 5 words, all with very high scores according to my system. So, what set was at the very top? Well, it wasn't just one set, but rather 19 different sets, all tying each other with a score of 16,561. I ended up settling on Favor, Slimy, Podge, Brunt, Whack. To be perfectly honest, I don't entirely remember why I chose that set, nor why I chose to put the words in that order. I think I may have just chosen the set with the most normal looking words, with the idea that maybe I could get lucky and one of those words could be the answer. Either way, with my starting set finally determined, it was time to get to work. I started doing runs on Hello Wordle, and I was able to beat Boktaba's time pretty quickly. However, considering the immense time save I had from not having the letter flipping animation, that wasn't exactly surprising. So, I kept playing. After a few more hours, I got a run that felt pretty good. A run that, after retiming, ends up being 1 minute and 10 seconds on the dot. This run was so good that it beat Boktaba's time even if you removed the letter flipping animations from his final total. And so, I uploaded the run to YouTube, claimed the world record for myself, and moved on with my life. Except, something was bugging me. I mean, 110 is only a mere 10 seconds off of the sub-minute barrier. Surely if I kept practicing, I could shave 10 seconds off my time, right? Suddenly, the idea of not just being the Wordle world record holder, but also being the first person to do 10 Wordles in under a minute sounded very enticing. And so, I reopened Hello Wordle, started the timer back up, and kept wordling. After a few days, I beat my time again, this time with a 105.09. Except, there was something a little funny about this run. I was so locked in that I actually kept going past the 10 word mark, and ended up doing 11 Wordles in total. I made a typing error on the 11th Wordle, so I'd assumed it was bad, and I uploaded the video to YouTube assuming that my first 10 Wordles were the fastest. However, it turns out that I had spent a lot of time thinking on my first Wordle. So much that my 11th Wordle, even with the typo, was actually faster. Thus, as this comment pointed out to me, my actual personal best at this point was 103.067. I was inching ever closer to that 1 minute barrier. Finally, I broke through. The next day, February 5th, 2022, I finally got the run I was waiting for. 10 Wordles in 58.15. I'd finally done it. I had the world record and it was underneath 1 minute. Wordle speedrunning had completely consumed me for these last few days, and while I certainly had fun with it, I was ready, for real this time, to move on to something else. In fact, I even put that in the video's description. Overall pretty happy with this, probably not going to try and beat it unless someone else does. Little did I know, this record was going to be beaten, and it was going to be beaten many, many times. In fact, in a way, it had been beaten already. You see, this run, which I was so proud of, was not the first sub 1 minute time. Unbeknownst to both me and Boktaba, there was a third runner, a runner whose abilities already far surpassed ours. Meet I Have No Name 248. On January 13th, 2022, a mere 2 days after Boktaba's initial world record, I Have No Name, or as he's also known IHNN, uploaded this video to YouTube. 10 Wordles in less than 1 minute. And this video showcases exactly that. However, unlike me and Boktaba, IHNN was speedrunning Wordle a lot closer to the normal way. Instead of dumping all 5 of his guesses instantly, he only used 2 of them at the start, later and coins. If information was low, he'd quickly add Pudgy to get some more data, but that was it. After just 3 guesses, he was already trying to guess the answer. This was, of course, much harder than me and Boktaba's 5-guess method, but it paid off. Out of his 10 Wordles, IHNN got 5 of them in 4 guesses and 5 of them in 5 guesses. This means, even in the worst case, he was still saving guesses and thus time on me and Boktaba. So, this had clearly been the world record for some time. In fact, it was the world record before I even started doing attempts. So the question remains, how did we miss this? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. The word speedrun simply just didn't appear in IHNN's title or description. Thus, when we were searching Wordle speedrun looking for potential competition, this video just didn't show up for us. And so, this world record remained unrecognized for months. I myself didn't find out about its existence until IHNN told us about it months later. But, now that we know about this run, I need to reevaluate all of my records. Obviously, despite thinking they were at the time, my 110 and 103 were not in fact the world record at any point. Furthermore, my 1558 was nowhere near the first run to be under a minute. However, IHNN's final time, after retiming to start at the first letter and end on the moment the 10th word turns green, was 58.71 seconds. And so, even though it was for much less time than I thought, I can still say that I am a former Wordle 10-word world record holder. My efforts were not in vain. After my last record, things were quiet for a few days. However, I did get a comment that caught my attention. It was from a user named Cloyce, and it simply stated, "Wow, this is really fast. Would you be interested in connecting with other Wordle speedrunners and enthusiasts on Discord?" Other Wordle speedrunners? As far as I knew at this point, it was just me and Boktaba. I was intrigued, and so I joined the Discord server that Cloyce was referencing. The server was created by QB the Cube, who you may remember as the one who created the faithful version of Wordle that Boktaba ran on. Speaking of Boktaba, he was also here. It was cool finally getting to meet the man who I had made into my rival. At the time I joined, the server was quite small, containing just 10 or so members. But still, it was very exciting to finally talk with like-minded people about this weird niche hobby. I shared my research and methods with them, and they welcomed me with open arms. All of a sudden, my motivation returned. I was no longer satisfied with only seeing this record go down under 1 minute. I knew it was capable of going much lower. And now, it wasn't just me anymore. There was a whole community of people, doing their own runs and coming up with new strategies to lower the record. Of course, there was still a fierce element of competition, but now it was underscored by a sense of camaraderie. If we all share information with each other, then we all become better, and as such, all of us have a better chance of being the new record holder. So, in order to try and grow this community as much as possible, I added this server link to the description of all of my Wordle videos. However, this was not the only Wordle speedrunning community out there. IHNN was part of a different community, and as you might be able to guess from his run, this community was far, far ahead of us. Now, since I was not directly part of this group, I can't say for sure what exactly brought them together. As far as I can tell, this was a group of people who shared a love of logic puzzles such as Wordle. Together, they would set a series of world records in the coming weeks using strategies much more advanced than ours. The first of these record holders was a runner named TCKMN, whose name I'll be pronouncing as Talkman for brevity. They would be the first to beat my run, posting a time of 57.88 on February 9th. Like IHNN, Talkman used a 3-word starting set, although theirs consisted of the words madly, count, and shire. Despite thinking longer on average across each word, Talkman's much lower guess count saved enough time overall for them to barely beat out my record. However, this run was just the tip of the iceberg for what this group would accomplish. That same day, the runner Love Math Boy posted a screenshot showing a run that was 48.92, an almost 10-second improvement on Talkman's record. Now, for this record, and for the rest of the records to come out of this group, proof was unfortunately lacking. Even the aforementioned screenshot has been lost to time, although I will say that I have seen it and can confirm it did exist. That being said, I don't see a reason to doubt that these claimed records really did happen. We already know from the footage we do have that this group was very advanced at their strategies, and it's not surprising to hear that they were able to absolutely dominate the world record for this period of time. And so, I will be including these records in this video. Anyways, Love Math Boy was not done. On the same day, he lowered his record to 42.51, and then again to 39.77. That means he not only broke the 50-second barrier, but the 40-second barrier on the same day. Things were moving fast. 2 days later, Love Math Boy would strike again with a 37.92. However, this time he had a challenger. IHNN was back, and he was better than ever. With a 36.75, he claimed the record back for himself, making him the first runner to reclaim the record after previously losing it. But Love Math Boy was not going to take this lying down. The next day, he posted a 36.18, followed by a 35.23. Surely, this would be enough to establish his dominance. It was not. That same day, a new runner by the name of Ev surged into the lead, posting a 34.88. Ultimately, Ev would claim the final world record from this group, beating their own time with a 33.41. Within the span of just 4 days, the record was nearly halved. How did that happen? Well, without video proof, we can't say for sure, but based on the footage we do have, I think I can make a reasonable guess. We can imagine that all of these runners were using 3-word sets, like IHNN and Talkman were. Thus, the main time save would be from reducing the amount of time thinking about the actual answer. It's my opinion that this group was the first group to understand the art of Wordle speedrunning for what it truly was. This was no longer a logic puzzle game. Trying to use logic and reasoning to solve the word was simply too slow. No, this was a game of pattern recognition. You see, after typing your starting set, the information Wordle gives you can be interpreted as a colored pattern of squares. Each possible answer word corresponds to one of these patterns. In order to find it as quick as possible, we need to disregard the actual letters themselves, but rather simply look at the positions of the colored squares. With enough practice, runners could learn to identify answers simply by looking at the colors. This would be, obviously, significantly faster than trying to identify the word the normal way. However, it was also much more difficult. This was a skill that needed to be built up, over time, through thousands of practice games. As such, these runners certainly had not mastered this skill yet. I'm certain that some of their Wordles required the usual pause in order to process this information properly. However, I'm also confident that they were much better at this skill than anyone else was at the time, and that was the key to why they were so dominant in this period. Meanwhile, in the server I was in, Cloyce had found something interesting. He shared a video he'd found on YouTube titled 10 Wordles in 46.75 seconds. You might not think that's very interesting considering I've just finished discussing records significantly better, but remember, at the time, we had no idea about what IHNN's group was doing. So for us, this video was revolutionary. As far as I knew, my time had just been smashed. Now, you might notice that this run was not played on Hello Wordle, but rather a site called Wordle Unlimited. This was another site that popped up in the peak of Wordle Mania, and it offered largely the same function. Unlimited Wordle games with instant guest coloring. That being said, it did seem to have a noticeably different answer list. At this point, it was well known that the Wordle answer list tried to avoid plurals, but this run had several plural answers. The community decided that this was not a significant enough difference to make the run any less valid, and Wordle Unlimited was accepted as a legitimate speedrunning platform. However, there was another thing noteworthy about this run, and that is the runner himself. You see, this run was uploaded to a channel simply titled Stanley Chapel. Cloyce recognized Stanley Chapel as Scalpel, a top-level speedrunner of the Japanese version of NES Mario Bros. 2. Scalpel was, and still is, the world record holder for level 8-4 in that game, the final level and quite possibly the most important level to optimize in the run. He also holds a number of other world records in that game, and has also recently made an appearance in the very prestigious Awesome Games Done Quick Speedrun Marathon. However, in another world, the name Stanley Chapel holds even more significance. You see, Stanley Chapel is the world record holder for the fastest 4x4x4 blindfolded Rubik's Cube solve. However, he is not just any world record holder. He is the undisputed, unquestioned, greatest of all-time cuber in this specific category. He is a full 9 seconds ahead of second place. He is so dominant, he literally offered to pay anyone who could get within a mere 8 seconds of his time. No one has been able to. This guy is legit. If you want to hear more about this story, I'll put a link to this vid by YouTuber StewCube in the description. So, imagine our surprise when we learned that this speedrunning and speedcubing legend decided to dabble in our little hobby. With one run, he quickly showed us that we all had much more work to do. It was shocking, yet also inspiring. Mainly, it proved to us that forward sets were viable, and we all got to work finding forward sets of our own. Thankfully, when I was researching my 5-word set, I made a list of the top scoring 20 unique letter forward sets in the process. So, I simply adopted one of those. That set was Flame, Brick, Podgy, Shunt. If you've watched my channel before, you're probably familiar with those 4 words, as I've used them in almost every single one of my speedrunning videos. So, if you were ever wondering where those came from, there's your answer. Speaking of my channel, this was around the time when it started to blow up. I had never expected the topic of Wordle speedrunning to ever garner more than maybe a couple hundred views. So when my view counts began creeping into the thousands, it was really exciting. Over the coming weeks, they would grow into the tens of thousands, and then the hundreds of thousands. Now, I'm not including this detail just to brag. This is in fact very significant to the history of Wordle speedrunning. You see, I have been putting that Discord link in the description of every single one of my Wordle videos. And, with the increased amount of eyes on them, a lot of viewers clicked that link and joined the server for themselves. This small niche hobby was turning into something greater, and our server was at the center point of it. Due to this, we had finally managed to merge the different communities into one central location. IHNN joined the server, and he told us all about his community's records and strategies. Suddenly, we understood that 3-word sets, while less consistent than 4-word sets, were also viable. While Scalpel never joined the server himself, members of his community did, and they shared information with us as well. Notably, a user by the name of CHBLD joined, and told us that he had an unrecorded 34.68 second time, putting him second in the world. But CHBLD didn't know about IHNN's community and Ev's 33.41 world record. No, when he said he was second, he meant second to Scalpel. You see, Scalpel at this point was claiming to have an unreleased 31-second run, which would make him the new world record holder. However, Scalpel never uploaded this run, and we don't even have a screenshot of the time. So, did it happen? Well, considering the man's other accomplishments, I have little reason to doubt that it did. Someone with so many other proven world records has no motivation to lie about a world record in something so niche. That being said, it's definitely the most controversial world record in this video, and if you don't personally consider it valid, I completely understand. Scalpel, if you're watching this and somehow still have the recording of this run, I humbly request that you upload that recording and formally add one more world record to your long list of accomplishments. So, with all the communities finally united, the question remained, who would set the next world record? Which community would they hail from? IHNN's group? Scalpel's group? Or maybe our main group would finally catch up to the meta and claim our first world record since my sub-minute run? The answer? None of the above. But before we talk about that, we first need to talk about Squabble. Squabble was an online multiplayer game created by streamer and developer Automated. It aimed to answer one simple question: what if Wordle was a battle royale? Squabble places you in an arena with up to 99 other players, and presents all of you with a Wordle board and an HP meter. The HP meter ticks down slowly over time, but refills a little bit every time your guesses result in new information. If you get the word right, not only will you get extra health back, but you will damage one of your opponents. The game will keep giving you new Wordles until just one player remains. What all of this means is that Automated had created a competitive game which punishes players who take too long thinking and rewards players who are able to solve a lot of Wordles very quickly. In essence, he had created a multiplayer game in which speedrunning Wordle was the optimal strategy to win. Even though Squabble didn't have any sort of rank system or leaderboards, if you give people an environment in which they can win over other people, they are damn well going to figure out how to do that the most effectively. As such, Squabble ended up being an unintentional training ground for Wordle speedrunning, and this training ground was about to produce the best runner that we had seen yet. This is Corey BLD. On February 23rd, Corey BLD joined the Wordle speedrunning Discord, and in his very first post, casually asked how he could submit his new time to the leaderboards. Now, this wasn't uncommon. We had new runners joining every day. However, what was uncommon was Corey's time, 32.23 seconds. Since Scalpel's record had no evidence, this would already put him at the top of our leaderboard. However, Corey was not satisfied with this. Less than 2 hours after his initial message, he posted another one. Update, I just got a 29.69. Vid coming very soon. 5 minutes later, and there it was. The 30-second barrier was broken. Corey's record was the first one in a while to have video footage, so we can see exactly how he managed to accomplish such a feat. Like Scalpel, he was running on Wordle Unlimited. Also like Scalpel, he was using a 4-word starting set: stead, flung, womby, and chirp. However, what set him apart was his solve speed. Corey spent almost no time thinking after typing his starting set. So little time that, despite typing an extra word on every board, he still handily beat the several former world records that likely used only 3 guesses. So, how did he get this good? Well, like I mentioned earlier, Corey was a big fan of Squabble, which served to train his pattern recognition. However, Corey was also a cuber, and while he wasn't quite at the same level of dominance in that field as Scalpel, he was still quite good in his own right, being the former North American record holder for the 3x3x3 multi-blind category. This is the second time the world record holder was also a blind speed cuber. Why is that? Well, when you boil down the two activities, they require very similar skills. Both speed cubing and speed wordling are fundamentally activities where you first need to process a pattern of colored squares and then quickly execute a sequence of inputs which vary based on that pattern. Blind speed cubing takes the pattern recognition to the next level and adds a layer of memorization to it, since the cuber isn't allowed to look at the cube during the solve. Thus, both Corey and Scalpel had been training their pattern recognition, pattern memorization, and finger dexterity for years before Wordle even existed. With this in mind, it makes sense that both of them rose to the top of this field so quickly. There's something else about Corey's run that's worth talking about. His starting set: stead, flung, womby, and chirp. This was a set that no one else in the community was using, and with it being the world record set, you might assume that Corey had stumbled onto something strong that we missed. However, the truth is quite the opposite. Corey's set simply isn't that good. You see, at this point in the community, we had begun to understand what exactly makes a starting set strong. Earlier, I had derived my starting set from the base assumption that sets which produced more yellows and greens would be better. Ultimately, this proved to be an incorrect assumption. Now that we understood that this was a game of pattern recognition, we were able to refine our definition of a good set. We were no longer looking for sets that were easy to solve. All we cared about now were sets which narrowed down the field the most. But what do I mean when I say narrowed the field? Well, remember how we can map each answer to a specific pattern produced on a starting set. It turns out, some answers map to the same pattern. For example, let's take my set of flame, shunt, brick, podgy. Take a look at this pattern. Do you know what the answer is? Well, on the Hello Wordle answer list, there's 2 possible answers: tower and voter. In a speedrun, the best a runner can do is simply guess one of the valid answers and hope it's right. If it's not, then the run is dead. Our times were simply too optimized to be able to afford an extra guess. We began to call these cases ambiguous words, and our goal was to avoid them as much as possible. Thus, we began judging sets by the number of ambiguous words that they had on the answer list. My set ended up with a score of 74. That means, for 74 out of the 1,429 answers on Hello Wordle's answer list, I'd be at risk of getting an answer wrong solely because of luck. That's around a 5.2% chance. Corey's set of stead, flung, womby, and chirp had a score of 104, giving him around a 7.3% chance of being forced to guess. Now this difference may seem small, but that's a full 2% higher chance across every single word. Add that up across a speedrun of 10 Wordles, and further multiply that across the hundreds of attempts Corey was doing, and that 2% turns into a pretty significant disadvantage. And yet, Corey was so good that it just didn't matter. He was the world record holder regardless, and he would be for quite some time. By the way, my set was nowhere near the best one that we knew about. Around this time, the community began putting some serious effort into optimizing the run. This effort was spearheaded by 2 top runners, CHBLD and Gaster. Neither of them were world record holders themselves, but both of them were quite high on the leaderboard. They began by manually coming up with promising sets and testing them against our various metrics. However, CHBLD managed to take it one step further. He had managed to write code which was optimized enough to do a near thorough search across all possible guess combinations. This was the first time we had anything approaching a complete search. So, what did he find? Well, initially, he found that the best four-word set was a tie between a number of sets with 42 ambiguous words. We ended up deciding that out of these sets, the best one was Rance, Swift, Godly, and Bumph. We did this by first ordering each set in a way where the words that give the most information were first. Then, we broke each set up into groups of 1, 2, and 3. So, for this set, the group of 1 would be Rance, the group of 2 would be Rance and Swift, and the group of 3 would be Rance, Swift, Godly. After doing this, it turned out that Rance, Swift, Godly, Bumph was the best for all 3 group sizes, and thus we deemed it the best four-word set. Except, one day, Gaster stumbled upon something that shocked us. He had managed to manually find a four-word set that scored better than 42. Spurt, Gombe, Chimed, and Woeful. This set only had 40 ambiguous words. How was this possible? Was CHBLD's search incomplete? Well, not exactly. It turns out that this set actually was in his results. It's just that his results were so large, they would take way too much time to fully sort. So, he used a simple Control F on various top values to find the top scoring sets. However, the file was so big that Control F took much longer than expected to finish. Thus, CHBLD was under the impression that some of his searches were finished when they in fact were not. So, this set was missed. With this revelation, CHBLD went back into his data and made sure that he had properly searched every single set. After this, he came back with another surprise. There was a set that had a mere 38 ambiguous words: Churl, Pomb, Swift, and Gandy. At long last, we had arrived at the true best four-word speedrunning set. So, how about three-word sets? Well, CHBLD did a search for those too. The best one was Splat, Mired, and Gaunch, with a score of 276 ambiguous words. These metrics serve to highlight just how much riskier using three-word sets was. If you thought Corey's 7.3 chance of ambiguity was high, Splat, Mired, Gaunch gives you a whopping 19.3% chance of being forced to guess. You were almost guaranteed to run into an ambiguous word on every single 10-word run with a three-word set. And yet, the time saved from not typing the fourth guess was enticing enough for some players to grind them out anyways. But, for now, Corey and his unoptimal four-word set remained on top. After his initial back-to-back records, Corey slowed down a bit. His previous records had been set on Wordle Unlimited, but once he had joined our community properly, we introduced him to our speedrunning platform of choice, Speedle. Remember Talkman and their 57.88 second record from back in February? Well, you may have noticed that their setup looked a little unusual. Most of us at the time had been using live splits to time our runs, and we had been manually hitting a split key between words. Talkman, however, seemed to have something that was timing their Wordles automatically. This was, in fact, an early version of the website that would come to be known as Speedle. Speedle was Talkman's modified version of Hello Wordle, with some additional features and settings that made it perfect for speedrunning. Since it was based on Hello Wordle, it had the same guess and answer list. This is why all of the research discussed earlier was based off of Hello Wordle's answer list. From this point forward, every single world record will be set on Speedle, and almost all of them will be using Hello Wordle's 1,429 word answer list. So what exactly made Speedle so great? Well, obviously, the automatic word timing made it so runners didn't have to hit an extra split key on their keyboard to track their times. This made runs a little less clunky to play. However, that was not all. Speedle also let you choose exactly how many Wordles you wanted to run. Then, it would keep track of your best time for that many Wordles. For example, if I choose to run 10 Wordles and then did 15 Wordles as fast as I could, Speedle would automatically log the time for the 10 fastest consecutive Wordles in that 15 Wordle stretch. This meant that runners did not have to think about timing their runs whatsoever. They could focus all of their attention on wordling and leave the timing to Speedle. Hawkman was originally from IHNN's group, and it can be assumed that many of the lost world records from that era were played on Speedle. However, the main community didn't find out about it until late February. Once we did, every single runner switched over to it. That meant, for runners like Corey who had been playing on Wordle Unlimited, there was a period of learning while they memorized the patterns of the new answer list. However, once Corey became acclimated to Speedle, he was faster than ever, and on March 1st, he broke his record once more, a new world record of 27.91. This run was a bit unique. You see, on the very last word of the run, Corey managed to get stead as the answer. With this bit of luck, he managed to save a little extra time over a typical run. However, this wasn't as crazy as it could have been. Corey had lost some time by typing stead as stedda, which meant he had to quickly backspace and fix his typo before continuing. The stedda time loss likely would have cost him his world record pace, if not for the fact that stead was the answer. As such, on a 1 in 1,429 chance, this doomed run managed to etch its place in history as the world record. You might think that the stroke of luck would result in this record standing for a long time, and you would be incorrect. A mere 6 days later, Corey broke his own record, and this time, no luck was needed. He posted a 27.05, with improvements solely coming from faster solves. 3 days later, he did it again, with a 26.93. No funny business here, just pure Wordle skill. It had been over 2 weeks since Corey joined the community, and still, no one was able to beat him. So, what was it going to take to dethrone him? Well, Corey had one glaring weakness. He was still using a 4-word set. Many runners of this era had switched over to 3-word sets and were grinding away at the record. Eventually, one of them would break through. On March 14th, a new runner joined the server by the name of Mint. Their first post was a 29.95, an impressive time, but not quite the world record. However, what Mint posted next was more interesting. A Speedle screenshot showing a 23.98. This would be the world record, and by quite a large margin. However, with no video recording, such an unbelievable time couldn't be accepted by the community as real. Mint would need to prove themselves first. And so, they got back to grinding. 2 hours later, Mint posted again, this time with a video. 10 Wordles and 25.95. With video proof, Corey had officially been dethroned. Except, Mint wasn't done. Later that same day, they posted again, this time with something even more shocking. A new world record of 24.44 seconds. In just 1 day, Corey had been beat by almost 2.5 seconds. It was clear this was no ordinary world record. This was the beginning of a new era. 3-word starters had finally arrived. How exactly was Mint able to shatter the world record so quickly? Let's start with the obvious. Mint was using 1 less guess per Wordle than Corey, which saved significant time. Since they were new to the community, they didn't know about Splat-Mired Gaunch. The set they used, Stare, Doily, Munch, had 374 ambiguous words, much worse than Splat-Mired Gaunch's 276. There was one unusual advantage to Mint's set. In their world record, Mint typos Stare as Stray multiple times. On most sets, being off by 1 letter like this meant the death of your run. However, Stray just so happens to also be a word. In fact, Stray Doily Munch has 376 ambiguous words. It's barely even worse. After we explained to Mint why Splat-Mired Gaunch was the best set, they were sold. They immediately switched over to it and began relearning the run. This gave other runners a brief window of opportunity to catch up before Mint took off with the record. And, as it just so happens, one of them did. On March 17th, the runner Bib posted a 24.36, barely beating out Mint's time. So, who exactly was Bib? Well, like Mint, Bib had only joined the server recently and was unaware of our most optimal starting sets. However, like Corey, Bib had tons of experience playing Squabble, and as such had already developed his wordling skills to a world record level. Thus, even with his unoptimal set of Drain Those Clump, Bib was able to barely eke out Mint's time and establish himself as a world record holder. Of course, with Mint learning the optimal set and even having an unrecorded 23-second time, we were all expecting that Mint would retake the record shortly. Like Stare Doily Munch, Draindo's Clump had 374 ambiguous words, meaning that Bib would be at a significant disadvantage going forward. Unlike Mint, Bib did not switch over to Splatmired Gaunch upon learning about its existence. He didn't want to relearn the muscle memory and pattern recognition that he had developed over the weeks of playing Squabble. So, it made sense that once Mint learned the new set, they would quickly retake the record. And that's exactly what happened. On March 19th, Mint posted a 23.38, a time which was a full second faster than Bib. Mint had not only reclaimed the world record, but had also smashed their initial unrecorded 23.95 second PB. Like Corey before, it was time for Mint to reign over Wordle for weeks to come. Except, something unexpected happened. That same day, Bib returned, and he returned with a bombshell, a 22.67 second time, still using Draindo's Clump. With this, Bib made something very, very clear. Him and his silly, unoptimal set were here to stay. This was not going to be an era of Mint dominance. This was a two-person race. Mint was not going to take this lying down. They got right back on the grind, and later that same day, Mint struck back with a 22.17. This had to be enough to knock Bib down a peg. I mean, with that set, how many runs is he even finishing? Surely it was going to take him a while to get a run this good again. It did not. On March 19th, 2022, still the same day as the previous 3 world records, Bib posted one more run. A run with a time of 20.28 seconds. The sun set and Bib was on top. Him and his starting set had won the day. 2 days later, he would improve this further with a 20.22. For now, Bib was the king of Wordle. However, his work was not done. 20.22 was tantalizingly close to another major milestone, the 20-second barrier. Back when Corey posted the first sub 30 time, sub 20 was just a pipe dream. I myself wasn't even sure sub 25 was possible, let alone sub 20. However, with Bib being mere milliseconds off, it was clear that the sub 20 was inevitable. At this point, Mint was no longer grinding the run. That left Bib as the only runner skilled enough to pull it off, and so he began grinding. Every day, Bib put hours into the run. Surely, it was coming soon. A day passed, then another. Still no sub 20. Bib was starting to get discouraged. It had to be possible, but it sure was proving to be much more difficult than expected. He collected himself, then went right back to the grind. And then, it happened. On March 24th, 2022, the 20-second barrier was broken. Except, there's a catch. The runner that broke the record was not Bib. It wasn't Mint or Corey either. In fact, this runner had never held the world record before now. This is Egg. Egg was not new. Having joined the community weeks prior, Egg was armed with the most up-to-date information we had. As such, they employed the strongest set. Splat, Mired, Gaunch. This paid off big. After weeks of slowly climbing up the leaderboard, Egg had finally broken out in a big way. It seemed like Bib's set had finally caught up to him. He couldn't get the luck he needed in time, and he had lost a race to sub 20. At this point, the run was simply too optimized to be able to afford the extra ambiguous words his set was producing. We were in a new meta, and only the most optimized sets could succeed. If Bib couldn't adapt, then he would be left behind. And that's basically what happened. Egg's sub 20 would hold for weeks. This was the longest time that a single run had been on top since IHNN's original sub minute. The 10 Wordle run was getting extremely optimized, and it was becoming too difficult to beat. But this does not mean Wordle speedrunning was dying. In fact, it was bigger than it ever had been. So far, this entire video has been focused on the 10-word speedrun. This is because this run is both the most popular and the most prestigious world record. However, over the months, the community had come up with several other different categories of Wordle speedrunning, and many community members shifted their focus to these more fresh and interesting runs. Many of these are quite obvious. In addition to the 10 Wordle run, we had leaderboards for 25 Wordles and 100 Wordles. For these longer runs, we implemented an additional rule. All Wordles had to be solved in a row. One failure would invalidate the entire run. This meant that these runs rewarded consistency over raw speed. Sadly, these runs and the other side categories of Wordle did not have their history tracked as thoroughly as the 10-word run. Thus, I can't tell you the full history of these runs, and to be honest, this video is long enough as is. However, from my memory, I recall that Corey BLD was the world record holder in both of these categories at the time. This makes sense. Corey and his 4-word starter were able to solve Wordles much more consistently than his 3-word competitors. And when it came to 4 words, no one could match Corey's speed. We also had runs for different word lengths. This entire time, Hello Wordle actually had the ability to generate Wordles using words from 4 to 11 letters. This allowed us to create an entirely new kind of speedrun, the all-lengths speedrun. Runners would have to consecutively solve one Wordle from each length, for a total of 8 increasingly difficult Wordles. With the amount of possible boards, pure pattern memorization simply wasn't viable here. You had to use logic and reasoning. As such, it made sense that IHNN ended up being dominant in this category early on. While others had eclipsed him in the realm of pattern recognition, IHNN was still the fastest at pure logical deduction, and this run rewarded him heavily for that skill. Speaking of IHNN, this was not the only category in which he got to showcase his thinking speed. Wordle, since its inception, has had a hard mode. In this mode, every guess must contain the correct information given to you from the previous guesses. So, if your first guess had a green letter, that green letter must be present in that position on all of your subsequent guesses. Hello Wordle, and by extension Speedle, took this even further. You see, those sites had a mode called Ultra Hard. Hard mode forces you to reuse all your correct information, but Ultra Hard forces you to use all your information. This means, in addition to needing to reuse yellows and greens, you also couldn't reuse a yellow in the same position, nor could you reuse a letter that was gray. Obviously, with these restrictions, starting sets simply wouldn't work. Runners needed to use their thinking skills. And so, it probably wouldn't surprise you to learn that IHNN was a record holder here as well. These categories were just the tip of the iceberg. We had leaderboards for 10 Wordles of every length. We had leaderboards for sites which let you play multiple Wordles at once. There was a mode implemented in Speedle where only the colors are displayed, forcing you to rely on memorization even harder. We had a leaderboard for that. We even had a leaderboard for the prestigious 1 Wordle run. And yes, people did just grind one word over and over for hours just to get on this leaderboard. The world record, by the way, is a 2-way tie between the runners ZW and Flying Severus at just 3 frames each. In fact, I'm going to shout out the current world record holder for every single one of these leaderboards at the end of this video, so stay tuned for that. Speaking of leaderboards, let's talk about them. If you're familiar with speedrunning, you probably know that most leaderboards are hosted on a site called speedrun.com. However, when we tried to apply for speedrun.com, they denied us. Apparently, they have an issue with hosting leaderboards for what they describe as web games. So, we were forced to do it ourselves. The leaderboard started as a simple Google spreadsheet that anyone could edit. When that was inevitably vandalized, the permissions were restricted to a limited set of leaderboard mods, trusted community members who took the time to validate each submission. As the scale of this community grew, so did the work that this position required. Without a leaderboard, there is no speedrunning community. As such, I'd like to give a special thanks to every single leaderboard mod whose hard work and dedication allowed this story and this video to exist in the first place. Before we get back to the 10-word run, I'd like to mention 2 more important community members, Little GWS and What's His Bucket. Both of these guys joined the community around the same time, and both of them heavily contributed to Wordle strategy research. Previously, we had been unable to do full searches across the entire guest list, due to there simply being too many combinations to reasonably search. However, these 2 managed to write code that ran so efficiently that we were able to, quite literally, evaluate every single combination of 3 or 4 guesses. With this, we were able to do a complete search and formally verify that both Splatmeyer Gaunch and Churl Palmby Swift Gandy were indeed the best sets. This was in addition to tons of other research across various other categories and topics. In fact, both of them have helped me with videos that, while related to Wordle, were completely unrelated to speedrunning. These guys, in addition to being programming wizards, were knowledge seekers, and their efforts taught us so much about the game as a whole. This is, of course, not to downplay their other accomplishments. What's His Bucket was quite the strong speedrunner in his own right. While he was never the champion of the 10-word run, he did hold world records in a game called Duo Trigordle. Duo Trigordle requires the player to solve 32 wordles at once, with the guesses being shared between all boards. Now, obviously there was a leaderboard for the fastest completion of Duo Trigordle, but there was another, much harder category, the perfect Duo Trigordle. In this challenge, every single guess had to be a correct answer, resulting in a Duo Trigordle completion of just 32 guesses. This meant that runners had to grind for a 32 out of 2,315 chance just for the privilege of doing one attempt. This was a brutal category, and as such, it makes it all the more impressive that Bucket held the world record for it. On the other hand, little GWS contributed a lot more to the community than just code that does searches. For one, he created his own Wordle clone, one that lets you play Wordles from one letter all the way up to 52 letters. This resulted in a very funny all lengths extended category that few have dared to challenge. However, he also changed how we analyze word sets as a whole. You see, the ambiguous words metric had a flaw. It did not take into account the size of the ambiguous sets. For example, let's say you had a set with 100 ambiguous words. If those 100 words were split into 50 groups of 2, then on every Wordle, you'd have a 100 and 1,429 chance of being forced to make a 50-50 guess. However, what if there was just one pattern that corresponded to all 100 of those ambiguous words? Then, every Wordle would still have a 100 and 1,429 chance of making you guess, but that guess would be a 1 in 100 chance. Obviously, the first case is much better for speedrunning, but the ambiguous words metric has no way of distinguishing these two sets. Little GWS fixed this flaw with a new metric he dubbed 1 over n. 1 over n simply measures the number of unique patterns that a given starting set is capable of generating. To explain, let's look at our earlier examples. For case 1, we'd have 1,329 unique patterns generated by the 1,329 unambiguous words. Then, we'd have 50 more unique patterns generated by the 50 unique pairs. This would give us a 1 over n score of 1,379. For the second case, we'd still have the 1,329 unique patterns, but our group of 100 ambiguous words would only generate one additional pattern, giving us a final score of 1,330. Thus, this metric properly tells us that set 1 is better than set 2. The community quickly adopted this new metric as the main way of judging starting sets. Of course, even with this new metric, Splatmire Gaunch and Churl Pombi Swift Gandy still remain the top sets. I know that was quite a long tangent, but I did call this video the history of Wordle speedrunning. So, while the story of the 10 Wordle record is the most important story, I think it would be a shame if I didn't at least try to give you a complete picture of what was going on in the Wordle speedrun community as a whole. That being said, let's get right back into the history of the 10 Wordle world record. When we last left off, Egg had broken the 20-second barrier. After 2 weeks of staying on top, Egg lowered that time even further, with a 19.21 second run. At this point, we noticed that improvements were getting rather small. The last several records had all been by less than a second. This, of course, made sense. As the time whittled down, we were getting closer and closer to the human limit of Wordle. At some point, we would simply be unable to type or think any faster than we already were. At some point, the record would become well and truly unbeatable. However, the question remained. What would an unbreakable record look like? What kind of time would we see? With interest in the 10-word speedrun still relatively low, it seemed like it was going to be a long time before we got answers to these questions. At least, that was until something unusual happened. You see, on April 12, 2022, Bib posted a screenshot in the Discord. A screenshot accompanied by a simple message. I just got an unbeatable world record. The 10th word was fucking drain. This had to be it. This run was already on record pace. Before the 10th word, Bib's time was a mere 17.2 seconds. Any Wordle under 2 seconds would have gotten the record, and Bib was more than capable of producing 2-second Wordles. However, the 10th word is what made this run legendary. Drain. And unlike Corey before him, Bib did not typo. In a mere 0.42 seconds, Bib had effectively cut almost an entire word out of the run. And that's not all. This run was only possible because Drain is on the answer list. Do you know what words aren't on the answer list? Splat, Mired, and Gaunch. That's right. The Splat, Mired, Gaunch players would never be able to replicate this run. Bib had stayed loyal to his quote-unquote unoptimal set, and it had rewarded him in a way that he couldn't even imagine. After retiming, this run was deemed to be 17.62 seconds. This, surely, was the limit of Wordle. Now, there's something that I need to clarify. Some of you might be thinking that this really isn't that special, and I see where you're coming from. Drain is a 1 in 1,429 chance to be the answer on any given Wordle. Any run has 10 chances to pull it. When you scale that up across the thousands of runs that Bib had performed by this point, it doesn't seem like it's actually that rare. And you're right. This certainly wasn't Bib's first time seeing Drain. However, most of the time, seeing Drain is not a good thing. In fact, it usually kills the run. But how is that possible? How can a fast answer possibly be a bad thing for a speedrun? Well, to understand that, you first need to understand just how optimized the run had become by this point. In order to consistently solve Wordles in under 2 seconds, absolutely no time can be wasted. As such, runners are forced to make assumptions during their runs. One such assumption is that all the words in the starting set will be needed to find the answer. Sometimes, the answer will become very obvious after just 1 or 2 guesses. However, in order to capitalize on that properly, a runner would need to process that information before typing their third guess. That would involve a brief moment of stopping and reacting to the information given after each guess. Even though this would only take a fraction of a second to do, those fractions add up over the course of 10 Wordles. This is time that they simply cannot afford to waste. Thus, since the vast majority of words will require 3 guesses to solve, modern runners type all 3 guesses before any thinking is done. This is how they are capable of solving Wordles consistently in under 2 seconds. With this in mind, let's see what usually happens when Bib pulls Drain as the answer. First, he types Drain. Then, he presses Enter to submit the guess. Since the guess is correct, the Wordle completes. Bib, not realizing this, types those. But, since the Wordle is solved, no letters appear on the screen. He then presses Enter again to submit those. But all this does is simply advance the game to the next Wordle. Finally, he types Clump and presses Enter for a 3rd time. By the time he actually processes the information on the screen, all he sees is Clump. Bib isn't expecting to see just one guess, and this brief moment of surprise breaks him out of his flow. At this point, he's wasted too much time being confused and the run is dead. Of course, there's one situation where none of this matters, and that is when Drain is exactly the final word of the run. When this happens, you get all of the benefits and none of the downsides. In Bib's run, Drain appeared as specifically the 10th answer, after 9 Wordles that were already solved in world record pace. Remember, Bib is working with a 26% chance of being forced to guess the answer on any given Wordle. One wrong guess kills the run. For Bib to get this miracle answer after successfully completing 9 Wordles on world record pace, well, the odds are astronomical. And so, the community quickly reached a consensus. Bib was right. This run probably wasn't going to be beaten. Without getting the same luck on the 10th word, you'd need to be solving Wordles at an average pace of 1.7 seconds. While 1.7 second Wordles aren't unheard of, getting 10 in a row required a level of both luck and skill that no one wanted to grind for. With this, Bib declared his retirement from the 10-word speedrun. Him and his trusty Drain-Dose Clump had left a legacy greater than anyone could have ever expected. Egg, upon seeing this run, conceded the race. With the top 2 runners moving on to other categories, no one was left to challenge Bib's record. And so, things went quiet. At least, they did for a few days. You see, after a bit of time to let things settle, Egg realized that Bib's run had a weakness. On the 5th word, wagon, Bib had paused for about a second before solving. This second, to some extent, counterbalanced the lucky 10th word and kept this run in beatable territory. With this realization, Egg had renewed motivation, and they started doing 10-word runs again. 6 days after Bib's run, they posted this, an 18-second time on the dot, a new personal best. But more importantly, a run that was in striking range of Bib's time. The record was not unbeatable. Egg could do it. And so, Egg kept grinding, and grinding, and grinding. But Wordle is not a kind game. Egg got plenty of runs that looked something like this. Insane paces, ruined by just 1 or 2 slow words. The run had to be coming soon. Egg kept going. At this point, over 2 weeks had passed, and Egg had nothing to show for it. But, just as things were looking bleak, Egg got on a run. 129, 154, 197, a bit slow, but Egg kept going. 128, 157, a good recovery. The record was alive. 177, good enough. 155, just 3 more. But then, disaster. On the 8th Wordle, a typo. Egg had typed a T instead of an R in mired. However, they weren't ready to give up. By some miracle, Egg was able to react and adjust their typing. They managed to complete the word with miter, a valid guess, but we were no longer in familiar territory. Egg had not trained on splat miter gaunch. For most runners, this small deviation would be enough to break their flow and kill a run. But Egg was not most runners. After only half a second, they entered epoxy. It was correct. 2.06 was not great, but it was workable. The run was alive. After a 187 and a 160, it was over. Egg had done it. On April 27th, 2022, the unbeatable record was not just broken, it was obliterated. 16.48. Egg had beaten Bib by almost as much as Bib had beaten them. And unlike Bib, Egg didn't need a miracle. This was a record born from hard work, skill, and dedication. With this, Egg had proven that they were the best wordler that this game had ever seen. And so, this record actually stood. With Bib retiring from 10-word and Egg being so far ahead of everyone else, no one was able to challenge this time. A month passed. At some point, Speedle added the ability to play using the original Wordle answer list. With no challengers in sight, Egg decided to challenge themselves by doing runs on this new, harder answer list. In doing so, Egg accidentally broke their own world record. Now, the time to beat was 16.36. Despite this, no one else was even close to Egg's time. Another month passed. Nothing. It was starting to look like Egg had actually killed the category. This was by far the longest that one player had ever remained on top. Did anyone else even have the motivation to challenge them? It had been over 6 months since Wordle had hit the mainstream, and it was starting to fade out of the public consciousness. With this, the Wordle speedrunning scene as a whole began to quiet down. This was inevitable, but it was still sad to see. With interest waning, would Egg's record ever be broken? One thing was certain. This was a record that was going to require a yet unseen level of dedication to beat. Wordle's speedrunning history is full of runners who burst onto the scene and instantly began setting records. Corey, Mint, Bib, even Egg only ran for a couple weeks before they set their first record. Those days were over. The record had become too optimized, too perfect. No, the runner who beat this run would be someone who damn well earned it. Someone who, over the course of months, dedicated themselves to improving their skills. Someone who remained focused and motivated despite declining interest in the game. Did such a runner even exist? Well, he did. And on July 13th, 2022, he made himself known. With a 15.84 second time, the runner Afink finally broke through and became the new world record holder. Afink had been grinding away in the background for months, slowly creeping up the leaderboard. First a sub 20, then a sub 19, a sub 18, a sub 17. By the start of July, Afink was breathing down the neck of Egg's record. And then, he was rewarded with the first sub 16 time. Unfortunately, Afik's YouTube channel was deleted, so I can't show footage of any of his runs. That being said, I have personally seen all of his records when they were uploaded and can assure you that he is legit. Afik started his speedrunning career using my set: Flame, Shunt, Brick, Podgy. Even back then, he was posting times at that set that were much better than I had ever achieved. Eventually though, he switched over to Splat-Mired Gaunch in order to truly contend for the record. Even though the videos are lost, we do still have screenshot proof of his record. From this, we can see something very interesting. This is the first record in which every single Wordle was solved in under 2 seconds. Affink's months of training had rewarded him with previously unheard of consistency. Thus, Affink's reign as the Wordle champion began, and as you may expect, it lasted quite a while. Wordle was only losing more and more relevance, and motivation was at an all-time low. In the coming weeks, Egg would retire from the 10-word run. With the former champion gone, who was left to challenge Affink's throne? Well, surprisingly, there were actually quite a few people. Affink was not the only runner on the rise. Over the past couple of months, the quest to beat Egg had hatched an entirely new generation of runners. Runners that had been practicing for months with modern strategies. Runners who were dedicated to pushing this time as low as it could feasibly go. Runners who wanted to see exactly what the human limit could be. So, while records were no longer being broken every week, this was still a period of hope. On September 11th, 2022, one of them would finally have their time in the spotlight. With a 15.55 second time, the new world record holder went by the name PSR J1478-2446AD. PSR, as she will henceforth be known, only beat Affink's time by a handful of milliseconds, and yet their runs could not be more different. While Affink achieved the record through unmatched consistency, PSR achieved it in spite of a glaring 2.3 second answer. Yes, the run had reached a point where 2.3 second Wordles were considered extremely slow. So, how the hell was this a world record? Well, every single other answer was below 1.7 seconds. Some of them were as low as 1.26. If you were to replace PSR's 2.3 second answer with a typical 1.7 second one, this run would have broken the 15 second barrier. As such, the potential of the run was clear for everyone to see. We had not yet hit the limit. Sub 15 was just going to be a matter of time. And yet, records were coming slower than ever. Another 2 months passed, and there was still no movement on the leaderboard. This was not due to a lack of trying. There were dedicated runners trying to break the record every single day. These times were just that difficult to beat. And yet, the runners that remained in this late stage persevered. Eventually, one of them was rewarded. It was Affink, and on November 11th, he was back on top with a 15.41. This was only a small improvement, but at this point, even the smallest of time saves was significant. In typical Affink fashion, this was another record achieved through remarkable consistency. Every word was solved in under 1.9 seconds. And yet, the sub 15 still eluded us. 2 months of grinding, and we still weren't there. The question remained, how much longer was it going to take? Well, after this record, something a bit strange happened. The last 2 records had lasted for around 2 months each. However, this record only lasted 5 days. But that's not all. In this era, every runner was on Splat-Mired Gaunch. There simply wasn't a good reason to use anything else. But this next record was not set with Splat-Mired Gaunch. No, this record was set with a different set. In fact, it's a set we've seen before. Drain those clump. That's right, Bib was back. And on November 16th, he reminded the new generation exactly who he was. A new world record, 15.31 seconds. Looking at the run, it was like he'd never left. This was the cleanest world record that he had ever achieved. Despite retiring from 10-word months ago, he had clearly kept his skills sharp. The return of Bib must have ignited something in our runners, because the records kept coming. Just 1 week later, Affink struck back, and this time, it was the big one. 14.88 seconds. No limits exist. The barrier had been broken. Months and months of grinding, finally rewarded. At this point, you might expect things to calm down again. With the sub 15 accomplished, the main motivating force of the community was gone. What was next? Sub 14? Affink was only milliseconds under 15. At this rate, sub 14 looked like it was years away. So, the community took a rest, and Affink remained on top for a long while. Or at least, that's probably what would have happened, if not for one very, very strange thing. You see, Affink's run was not the only record set on November 23rd. That's right. After just a few hours, his record was already broken. This had not happened since February. With months between preceding world records, it was frankly unthinkable that it would ever happen again. And yet, that's not the strangest part. You see, this record was set by a runner who had never set a 10-word record before. His name was DVB-TV. Now, you might not find this too surprising. I did say there was a whole new generation of runners, and DVB-TV was indeed among them. Perhaps it was inevitable that another one of them would rise to the top. No, the strangest part of this run was not the runner, nor was it the date it was set. It was the run itself. This category has been home to some truly strange and shocking world records. Records with heartbreaking chokes and incredible saves. Records with unfathomable odds. Records with strategies that no one expected. And yet, this record is unquestionably, unmistakably the strangest of them all. Why? Well, DVB-TV wasn't even trying to set the 10-word record. He was trying to set the 10-word blind record. And while trying to set that record, he got a run so good that it became the record in both categories. 14.52 seconds. Furthermore, he was using a set that was completely new to the world record. Flame, Shunt, and Brick. A set derived from my ancient runs all the way back in February. How good was this set? 407 ambiguous words. It was worse than Drain Those Clump, let alone Splat Mired Gaunch. And yet, this was the new world record. A record played in a completely different mode, using a very unoptimal set, played by a runner who wasn't even trying to break it. And yet, even after all of that, we still haven't gotten to the strangest part of this run. There's one last little detail that I need to talk about. Wordle number 6. DVB-TV got Flame as the answer. As I've previously discussed, this is a run killer. Runners simply can't react fast enough to properly capitalize on the one-word solve. There's a reason world records have only ever had these if they are the final word of the run. No one has ever been able to salvage a run after a one-word solve breaks their flow. That is, no one until DVB-TV. After typing Flame and pressing enter, DVB-TV didn't even hesitate. He immediately collected himself and solved the next Wordle in a mere 1.68 seconds. So how was any of this even possible? Well, it turns out that DVB-TV was also a top-level runner of the aforementioned ultra-hard category. A category in which a runner is forced to stop and think after every single guess. In fact, by this point, he had already been a world record holder in that category. As such, he had been training his brain in a way that the other runners at this level simply hadn't. Through grinding ultra-hard runs, DVB-TV had become so good at reacting to guess information that he was able to fully capitalize on Flame while barely losing time on the next word. This skill also helped him on his 8th word, in which he reacted to the information provided by Flame and Shunt and was able to solve the answer without needing to type Brick. Unfortunately, like many lucky runs before, this run also had a glaring weakness. Word number 9 was a pattern that could belong to one of 4 possible answers: River, Rider, Piper, and Giver. DVB-TV was forced to guess, and sadly, he guessed wrong. He did manage to quickly react to the incorrect guess and was able to swiftly solve the Wordle on the 5th guess. But the damage was done. 2.68 seconds. A word that would normally kill any world record pace run. Fortunately for DVB-TV, this run was far from normal, and all this did was slightly offset his earlier time save with Flame. Thus, while this run was incredible, it was also clearly beatable, and so runners got back to work. On December 7th, Bib was the first to strike, with a 14.44. Despite only a small time save, this run was extremely clean. Every single Wordle was solved in under 1.8 seconds. The pace that had been teased by DVB-TV's run was realized, and yet it could still go lower. DVBTV's first 5 words were on sub 14 pace. There was still more to be done. The next record was set by another runner of the new generation, Blue Red. Like DVBTV, Blue Red set this record while grinding for the blind world record. But, unlike DVBTV, Blue Red's record was nothing but clean, fast solves. With this 14.25 second run, Splatmired Gaunch was once again back on top. Blue Red had finally etched their name into history books after over half a year of grinding. At this point, we were fast approaching the 14-second barrier. We were so close, it simply had to be possible. And so, motivation was still high, and the world records kept coming. Blue Red's record lasted 2 weeks before another new challenger appeared. This runner went by the name of Pog, and he barely squeezed in a world record with a 14.22 second time. Pog was by far the newest runner to hold the record, having only joined the community in late August, and that inexperience showed in the run. In Blue Red's record, they were able to recognize and type a good number of their answers instantly. This was due to the extremely strong pattern recognition that they had built up across hundreds of thousands of Wordles. Pattern recognition so strong that they were able to set a world record without even needing the letters. Pog, by contrast, had a clear pause between the guesses and answers on every single Wordle in his run. So, how could he have possibly gotten the world record? The answer is simple: typing speed. Now, it's not revolutionary to say that a runner who types fast will have an advantage in a speedrun that consists entirely of typing. And, as you may expect, all top-level runners dedicated a good amount of time to specifically practicing typing their starting sets. However, as the run got shorter and shorter, time save mainly came from faster pattern recognition, as opposed to faster typing. To demonstrate this, let's compare the typing speed of Bib across 2 of his records. In March, Bib set the world record with a 20.22. This run was recorded at 30 frames per second. So, I picked a random Wordle from the middle of the run and counted exactly how many frames it took for him to type his 3 starting guesses. From the first frame that a letter appears in the puzzle to the frame that he submits his 3rd guess, it takes Bib 27 frames at 30 FPS to type all 3 of his starting words. I then did the same count for his 14.44 second record set in December. The results? 43 frames at 60 FPS. If we average these speeds across 10 Wordles, Bib saved around 1.83 seconds from faster typing. Yet, his later record is almost 6 whole seconds faster. Thus, we can only conclude the bulk of the difference is improved pattern recognition. I timed some of the other recent record holders in order to get a better sense of how these times differed across the player base. Egg clocked in at 24 frames at 30 FPS. Blue Red and DVBTV both did slightly better, 21 frames at 30 FPS. This is to say, over the past several months, improvement in typing speed ranged from slight to non-existent. With several runners clocking in at 21 frames, or around 0.7 seconds, it seemed as if we had hit a limit. Well, that is until Pog showed up. On Pog's recent world record, he typed his starting set in a mere 33 frames at 60 FPS. This converts to 0.55 seconds, a full 0.15 seconds faster. Now, this number might seem small, but remember, that is a 0.15 second time save per Wordle. Add that up across 10 words, and Pog's typing speed was already saving him a full 1.5 seconds over his competition. With this in mind, it became clear that 14.22 was only the start of what Pog was capable of. For him, sub 14 was an inevitability. And beyond that, who knows? He was just missing one crucial piece: pattern recognition. All he needed to do was develop that one final skill, and he would become unstoppable. However, Bib was not ready to concede just yet. He was the final remaining top-level runner from the older generation, and he was also the most tenacious. Time and time again, Bib watched as his records were beaten by waves of new and upcoming talent. And yet, each and every time, he had managed to take the record back. Bib had set 7 individual records in the 10-word speedrun, more than any other runner. And so, just one day later, Bib took a look at Pog's destiny and claimed it for himself. A new world record. 13.94. Bib had broken the 14-second barrier, a barrier that might just be the final one ever broken. And this run was clean. Not a single Wordle solved in over 1.6 seconds. Bib was hitting paces thought impossible in the era that he started. And yet, this run would be his last hurrah. After one last grand achievement, Bib faded into the background of Wordle history. In fact, this would be the last world record that anyone would set in the 10-word category. That is, anyone except Pog. Going into the new year, Pog was determined to reach his full potential. He knew he was capable of sub 14. He knew he was capable of beating Bib's record. And he knew he was capable of setting records that no one else could even dream of touching. And so, on January 7th, 2023, that's exactly what he did. With a 13.39 second time, Pog launched himself back to the top of the leaderboard. And this time, he would have no visible weakness. His pattern recognition had caught up, and he was achieving paces that were previously unheard of. This record had 2 solves in under 1.2 seconds. If we exclude Wordle solved in under 4 guesses, this had only happened in a world record once before, a single 1.119 by Blue Red. Pog had gotten 2 in just this record, and that was in addition to a litany of sub 1.3 solves. At this point, there was no denying it. Pog was, and still is, the greatest player that Wordle speedrunning has ever seen. The question is no longer who will set the next record, only how low will it go. A mere 11 days later, Pog graced us with yet another unfathomable time, 13.09. Another sub 1.2 word, 5 sub 1.3 words. Wordle speedrunning had been pushed farther than anyone could have possibly imagined. And so, it was down to one man to bring it to its logical conclusion. One last barrier. With less than a 1/10 of a second to shave, it was all but inevitable. And yet, it just wasn't coming. Pog was persistent. He grinded hundreds, thousands of runs. Yet, the sub 12 still eluded him. Weeks passed, then months. The record remained. The barrier was intact. Perhaps we had gotten too caught up in our own hype. Perhaps there truly is a limit to how fast humans can type, how fast we can think. 13 seconds? We used to barely comprehend doing 10 Wordles in under 20 seconds. The fact that we even made it under 15 is an anomaly. Perhaps 13 seconds truly was a foolish wish. By 2023, Wordle was well out of the public's consciousness, and interest was fading fast. 13.09 really is an impressive time. Maybe we should be grateful that we got this far at all. If this is truly where the story ends, then it certainly is an impressive ending. But man, it really would have been nice to break that one last barrier. Sadly, Pog never did. But that was for one simple reason. You see, when describing what Pog did to the 13-second barrier, the word break simply doesn't suffice. On April 15th, 2023, Pog did not merely break the barrier. No, he smashed it, destroyed it, obliterated it. Pog performed the greatest Wordle speedrun that this world has ever seen. The world record that has lasted over 2 years and counting. 10 Wordles in 12.48 seconds. This run had it all. Every Wordle solved in under 1.5 seconds. 6 Wordles in under 1.3 seconds. 3 in under 1.2 seconds. And, to cap it all off, the final Wordle, solved in a mere 1.09 seconds. The first world record to contain a sub 1.1 Wordle. This was it. This is what the last 1.5 years had all been building towards. This was the pinnacle of human Wordle achievement. So, where do we go from here? Well, considering this record hasn't been challenged in over 2 years, you might believe that the community finally died. Fortunately, that isn't the case. To this day, the speedrunning Discord is still active. Pog, Bib, Blue Red, and more all still occasionally pop back in to do some more runs. And Speedle is right there, still freely available for anyone to try. Sure, Pog's record has stood for much longer than any previous record has, but that doesn't mean it can never be beaten. Maybe Pog himself will return to fully realize his potential. Maybe one of our top runners will shock us all by beating the man who seemed unbeatable. Or maybe, just maybe, someone completely new could come along and revolutionize the run, much like Pog had done over 2 years ago. And maybe, dear viewer, that person could be you. My name is Pokecheese, and thank you for watching the history of Wordle speedrunning.